Hey everyone, in this video we're going to look at integrating with a large language model, specifically GPT-4o as part of the Azure OpenAI service using REST. And specifically we're going to do it from PowerShell just to show I can really interact from anything at all. And also when I posted the video about getting started for the non-developer using AI, someone said, well, could you do this from PowerShell? So I was like, okay, let's go ahead and show that. Now remember, in the other video I did, AI for the non-developer, I used the software development kit, an SDK for Python. But if I think about what a software development kit very often these days is doing, it's providing a wrapper around some RESTful endpoint. Now obviously there's other types of SDK that don't do that, but in this example, and for many types of service, it is abstracting away a REST endpoint. And a REST endpoint is something I can communicate with just using HTTP. So if I can talk web, if I can talk to a URL, then I can use the REST endpoint. So what is happening is we have the endpoint. Now it's a URL. Now obviously we want security, we want TLS encryption. So it's going to be a HTTPS. And now we're talking to a resource in Azure. So what we're going to go ahead and do, and I'm going to show this in a second, but we're going to create an Azure OpenAI resource. Now that resource is going to have a name. So we're going to call it resource name. And then the endpoint will then be .openai.azure.com. So that's a big chunk of the endpoint we're going to be talking to. And what we do from that is we post commands, requests over HTTPS to that. For example, I might send a request and I'm using post. That's very common when I'm interacting with this. And I'm doing that using REST. REST is just how I'm interacting with that URL. And so what we saw in the other video is we're wrapping that RESTful interface with a software development kit. Now, the software development kit really just means I don't have to really know or understand that anymore. It provides something very intuitive for that particular language. So the SDK, it's calling via REST this endpoint. And our SDKs are things like C# and Python, like Go, Java, like JavaScript. There could be others. And I'm sure people go ahead and create libraries for other things that may not be the official ones. So obviously I can, if I'm using these languages, I can use the nice SDKs that give me these nice intuitive libraries and objects for whatever I'm using. But I can absolutely also, really anything, can go and talk to the REST endpoint directly. And it's this anything we're going to focus on today by using PowerShell as an example. Now, what do I need to do this? And it is the same as the other, AI development for the non-developer. Obviously, the first thing I have to have is an instance of an Azure OpenAI resource. So I have to have the resource. Now, if we jump over to the portal for a second, let's go ahead and look. So here, I'm in the Azure portal. And I could just start off actually just looking at the various Azure AI services. And one of them is Azure OpenAI. And then within there, I go ahead and create an instance of the Azure OpenAI resource. Now you would pick a particular region, you give it a name for the resource. So this is just an Azure Resource Manager resource name. You have different pricing tiers, etc. But you go ahead and create the resource. Now I've created a number of these in different regions because some models are available in specific regions. But if we go and look at my example here, one of the things we will go ahead and see is keys and endpoint. So specifically for mine, I can see the name of my resource was savtech- WUS3 OpenAI. So that's my resource name, and then it's .openai.azure.com. And again, you can see up here, well, there's my resource name. So step one is I require the Azure OpenAI resource. And it's the resource that has and owns that particular endpoint. So I can think about this piece right here. Well, that's part of the Azure OpenAI resource that I need to go ahead and create. And then there's other parts of the URL. There's like a, just stick to that, /OpenAI/deployment. Might be deployments. I think it's deployments. And then we get to the next interesting part. So far, all I've done is create a resource, but there are no models deployed into it yet. So what I then have to do is actually go and do a model deployment. So once again, if we jump over, great, I've got keys and I've got endpoint. If I go to model deployments, we don't actually manage them within here. I could click this link and it will take me to the Azure OpenAI Studio, but I can also do it from the Azure AI Studio. The Azure AI Studio also supports other models from other vendors. There's other capabilities I can work with other people so I can collaborate on things. I have projects, etc. So here you can see I've actually created some deployments in that particular resource. So it is the name that I care about, not the model name. So it's this column on the left, whatever value I have in here, and then mine is the same again, but this is what I care about. Could have lots of deployments of a particular model with different names. And just click on this particular instance. It shows me that full endpoint URL, and it is deployments. So now I can see it also has the deployment name. So again, it's the deployment name that I actually care about as part of that URL I'm going to call. So we've got the endpoint. Now we're carrying on building this. So now the next important part that's going to vary is that deployment name. So now we have that in there. So this is the model deployment, the name I gave it when I did that deploy name. And then there's, once again, a bunch of other things. Now we call a particular endpoint path for what we want to do. Now, what we're dealing with is a newer large language model of GPT. It's 3.5 and above. And what we're going to call is this chat completions endpoint. Then there's some other things. There's like an API version. There's a few different things there. But the main part we're going to care about is this. And the benefit of the chat completions endpoint is it's multi-turn. It has the concept that I can send it a prompt, but also a history of what's come before. So it has a context of an ongoing conversation that lets me have these multi-part interactions. So I could say, hey, what's the capital of the US? It gives me an answer. And then I could just say, well, what about the UK? I don't have to say what's the capital of the UK because it has a history. It has the context of that interaction. There's also a /completions endpoint, which is single turn, and that will be used by pre 3.5. And so we require this particular URL. And if we start thinking about how we're going to do that in REST, if we jump over again, if I now bring up the actual application we're going to use, what I'm doing is the endpoint, just the fully qualified domain name part, i.e. the resource name .openai.azure.com. I'm storing in one environment variable, and then my model deployment name I have in another. Now I'm fetching these from environment variables. What I actually did is I defined those as part of my user space of the profile, so I have these defined. Now, you could store these in Azure Key Vault. They could be application environment variables. I could use Azure App Config. There's a million different ways you can store these. I just didn't want to hard code them directly into my script. So I'm grabbing those variables to do a quick check to see if they exist. And then all I'm really doing here is I'm constructing that full endpoint. So I'm creating the AI URL. So if I actually just ran these bits on their own and then ran this line, what I'll end up with should be that fully constructed endpoint, which is what I've got. So this is what we're going to talk to. That's everything we're going to interact with. So fantastic, we now have this URL that I can go ahead and communicate with. The next thing we need to do is authenticate. Because what I don't want to do is just have this open endpoint that anyone can go and talk to. Because obviously I pay for the tokens, I pay for the work it does. And so if I just had this open endpoint, people could start bombarding it with inference requests. And inference is when I'm asking the model to do that probability distribution check of what's the next most probable token, the next. It's the work it's doing to do the prediction. Well, I don't want people bombarding it. So we have to authenticate. Now, where I'm doing the authentication is against the Azure OpenAI resource, not any particular deployment. So I'm thinking about, okay, my authentication is on the resource, and we have two options. We saw there were keys. So I can do a key base. I could store that key in something like Azure Key Vault. I could then fetch it from my application. Maybe my application has a service principal or managed identity that has permission on that secret in the Azure Key Vault so it can fetch it and then leverage it as part of the call. I'm going to put it in a header. Or the other thing we can do is role-based access control on the resource because it integrates with Entra ID authentication. And for the most part, we're going to have an Entra identity. Now, if I'm an Azure resource, I could probably use managed identity, where maybe it's a system assigned where the identity's lifecycle is tied directly to the lifecycle of the resource. It might be a user assigned where the identity is separate and I give it access from multiple different resources. Maybe they all need the same sets of permissions. So I can create one identity, but only those resources could use. If I can't do that, I could create a service principal. And then that service principal authenticates maybe with a certificate, and then it would have that particular role-based access control. And I prefer this. I don't want to have to manage the key. I don't want to have to store the key. We never put it in the code. We don't want to check it into repositories. If I can, I'd rather just use the Entra ID authentication and the role-based access control on the resource. So if we were to jump over, I'm going to go back to my particular Azure AI resource. And remember here, we did have the keys. We get two of them, so I could be using one and rotate one. I can obviously regenerate if I think they've been compromised, or just as part of good operations, I may potentially regenerate them every 90 days or something. But if I go to my access control and look at my role assignments, I actually gave myself this one, Cognitive Services OpenAI User. Now, that works. That gives me the permissions I need. It's more than I need. All I need to do is chat completions. So technically, if you wanted to be super, super strict, I could go and create a custom role. Now, remember, what am I doing? I'm interacting with the data plane. I don't care about particularly as a user of the model. I want to be able to call this endpoint, and I'm going to post a request to get a completion. As a consumer of the service, I don't care about the Azure Resource Manager control plane, which is things like creating resources, modifying resources. I don't do any of that. I care about the data plane interactions. And so what I actually care about from a permissionings perspective is right here. I have data actions. So if I go and look at the data actions, what I'm really looking for here, and I have to find where about this is, there'll be a completion. Here we go. So we can see here there are specific data plane actions for creates a completion. And if we hover over it, it will actually tell us what that specific action actually is. And the documentation goes through all of this. But I'm just trying to point this out that, hey, I'm giving myself this role so I can do role-based access control, so I'm not having to use a key. But remember, in the real world, what we really like to do is least privilege. So giving myself that role is not least privilege. I don't need all of those other things. And certainly if I had an application or maybe a broader community consuming this, they don't need that permission. I could go and create a custom role and just give them the very specific actions they need. So that would be a best practice approach. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that in my code. And if we go and look at the code, I'm actually being really lazy. I require you to have already authenticated to Azure. Now, this could be you're running in a resource that has a managed identity, maybe from PowerShell. I've got the Azure command module and I've done the authentication already. But all I'm doing is I'm actually using this get AZ access token command right here. And I'm saying I need it for the cognitive services resource. So it's just going to go ahead and give me a brand new token for cognitive services. And then because we're talking REST directly, I have to create a header. And my header is just saying, hey, it's of type JSON. And for my authorization, instead of using a key, I'm using a bearer token. I am the bearer. I have this token. And I'm sending it the actual token that was returned as part of the token object. So that's me constructing my authentication header. And so now, if I think about what I am going to do as part of my anything that can talk REST, what I'm constructing right here is, okay, I've got my header. And I'm putting in as part of, this is all JSON, as part of my authentication, my authorization. Here's my token. So that's how it can go and check. I'm not proving I have possession of the key, which is the other thing I could do. Hey, here's my token that's integrated with Entra ID. And then we're ready to start actually doing the inferencing. And all I have to do here is now I think about the body of the request, and it really boils down to a set of messages. And the messages have a role and then the content. So we talk about prompt engineering. I have a system prompt which tells the model how I want it to behave. Hey, you are an AI assistant, you're super helpful, or you're an AI assistant working with school children aged 8 to 10, help them understand or prompt them, whatever you want to do in there. Then I would have the role of the user, which is their request. Then there's the role of the assistant, which is the response it gives. So I have those different roles available to me. And what I'm going to do then is just create an array to store those. Now, if we look at where I'm actually in, is I created a separate function that is just sending to GPT for a completion. And I send it the array of the messages, which I'm going to deal with somewhere else. And so all this function has to do is construct the body. So it's saying the messages are that array of messages it's been sent. I'm limiting the number of tokens it can use for the output for the inferencing to 2048 because I'm cheap. And the temperature, this is how creative the model. I think this is from 0 to 2.0. A low number like .3 means don't be terribly creative. The response will be more predictable. If I wanted it to be very imaginative, maybe I'd use a value of 1. But here I'm just creating this list of values, keys and values, and I convert it to JSON. Because we're talking REST, everything is JSON. And then all I do is I call a REST method. So I'm invoking the REST method. I'm passing it that URL we created. I'm using a method of post. I'm giving it the header we created with the authorization in it, and the body, which has our messages, our max tokens, and our temperature, i.e. your creativity. I catch if there's an error, maybe I've run out of quota, for example. So I do a limited amount of error checking here, but it's minimal at best. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. I'm going to get a whole JSON body back from this, but it does break it down into an object because I'm using invoke REST method. And so then all I return is the actual inference content. Now, this response would also include things like the content, safety content checking, the number of tokens. It would have a huge amount of other information. All I'm doing is returning the content, the inference it did. So that's really the entire set of the function. Everything else, then I'm just actually creating a function that lets you do a few things. So I let you say, hey, clear the history, use the content of the clipboard, and then obviously the string, which is the remainder of stuff that you actually type in that's the request. The clear is because I do maintain a history, so you can, between interactions, ask prompts based on previous content. Maybe I have something interesting in the clipboard I want to just add to my request. To facilitate that, I create a little JSON file where I store the history. So I'm putting it in the local app data path so it won't roam between machines. And I'm calling it my savgpt get completion data.json. I then create an empty array. I only want to keep a history of 5 interactions because I don't want to start flooding it with too much and maybe it starts to become less relevant. I do check if that configuration file exists, i.e. the history file is there. If it's not there, I treat it as if you run clear, so it's starting from scratch. If it's clear, I set the system prompt. So the system prompt, I'm using ordered just because I want to keep role in front of content. I don't know if it really matters with the API, but I'm playing it safe. And all I'm saying is you are an AI assistant that will help answer questions. So it's super, super basic, not particularly good. If I'm not clearing the history, then I just load in the content from my history file, and I'm converting it from JSON. I do a quick check on how much history we have. If we have more history than I want to keep, so I want to keep 5 is what we have here. So if it's more than, because when any interaction happens, remember what we have is the user role asks something and the assistant answers it. So for every interaction, there will be 2 messages. And so what I care about, and that's what it's doing in the code, is, hey, if from a history perspective, the number of messages we have is greater than the number of history I want to keep times 2, because the user role and the assistant role, and then 1 for the system prompt. If it's greater than that, we're going to trim away the history. So all I do is I keep the system message, which will always be the first one, which is array item 0. And then I copy in everything that stays within that history number. So I subtract away the extra ones and then just copy that in. The prompt string is just all of the words after clear or use clipboard. If I want to use the clipboard, so I pass that parameter, I grab the content of the clipboard, then I'm going to add it to the user's prompt as additional information, and then add in the content of the clipboard. And then I just add into my messages array as role user, that prompt string, and then send it to the function we created. And then the response, if it's not null, I want to store the response in the history as well. So I have both the assistant and the user. I would then output it to screen as well. And then we store it all to the JSON file. And then I export this function so it's available as part of the module. And that's it. And that's really all of the code is doing. It maybe seems a lot more complicated than it really is. So if I was playing around, so the first thing I have to do is import the module. So for right now, if I updated it, I would import it. Or again, you could store it in somewhere that's in your module path for PowerShell, but I haven't done that. And then you can just start asking things. So I could say get GPT completion. Let's clear it. What is the capital of the United States? Now remember what this is doing. In my example right here, I have a deployment of the latest Azure OpenAI 4.0, the Omni model. All it knows is the knowledge that was used to train the model. So it's pre-trained knowledge. I am not using RAG in this example. So I'm not, for example, integrating with Azure AI Search for my transcripts that I've done in other videos to add knowledge. It is not going and searching the internet to add knowledge beyond its training date. So it only knows for that pre-trained. I could add that. It's very easy to add those things to it, but it only knows what it was trained on. So just kind of an important thing to bear in mind as we go through this. Now, as part of this, remember, it saves its history as it's going through. So if I looked in my app data, specifically local SavGPT, I have this GPT complete data JSON file. If I open this, we can see what it's storing. Oh, okay, so it has that history. So the next time I run a command, so let's take out the clear. I don't want to do that. What about the UK? It knows, oh, it wants to know about the capitals because it has the history that it read in for that. And once again, now if I looked at the history file, now it has what about the UK? So it has that full concept. Now maybe if I'm going through this, if I select this and I'm copying it to the clipboard. So let's run it again. Let's clear it. But we'll also say use the clipboard. So I'm going to add in that code. What does this do? So it would have added the clipboard content as additional information. And now, hey, it's telling me what this actually does. So it's just a kind of fun, useful thing I can do here. And the other thing I always have to do whenever I'm trying any of these things is to see what the new model is doing. Who is YouTuber John Saville? And then it will go off and say whatever that is. Okay, often shares expertise. That's very generous of it for his YouTube channel. Anyway, but you see how easy it is. You can see how it has the history. I'm updating that history file when I do the clear with whatever that content is. So between all my various interactions, I get that consistent set of experience. And you saw how easy it is. Again, this was PowerShell, but anything I think really that exists today can call an endpoint. And so I could leverage this wherever I need to if I want to add some natural language, some generative AI into my application. Now, once again, I didn't include things like Azure AI Search. It would have been really easy in this structure here. There's actually a data sources element I could have added. I could have set it as an Azure Search, and I could have included a link, an authorization to my index to use my Azure AI Search. I could have written something to go and hook into, I think actually Cognitive Services has a Bing API. I could have gone and searched Bing, for example, and add knowledge post its training date, and maybe even the content to make it more worldly. I think if I went that route, I'd probably use something like the semantic kernel or maybe LangChain instead, because I don't want to start getting into reinventing the wheel at that level. But hopefully that gave you an idea of exactly what it could do. Because again, I'm just using the regular deployment. It has a training date. It knows stuff up to that date on what it was trained on. If I need private data that it wasn't trained on, I would definitely want to use RAG. And once again, we would probably change that system prompt to guide its behavior more and more. And the reality is this is pretty cheap. Like for me doing these odd interactions, if I go and look at the pricing, for the 4.0 model, you're paying in terms of per 1,000 tokens for the input stuff I'm sending to it. So it's half a cent per 1,000. The output, i.e. the generated response, the inferencing, is 1.5 cents. For me playing around over the last week with this, you can actually see my costs. So there's my Cognitive Services output and input. It's cost me 13 cents. Now, realize that's just me. That's not me doing a huge amount. If you start having these en masse for huge amounts of users, you do want to watch these things. You want to make sure you are controlling those interactions so this doesn't balloon to something. Are there other options as part of architectures? We look at what we're actually using it for. Do I need to use a large language model? Could I use a small language model and maybe use some local compute for these things? What is the response I need from the user? If it's a critical path, do I want to use things like provision throughput units that would let me have a certain guaranteed amount of capacity used for my interactions? I could even use API Manager to split the requests depending on where I'm going based on the tokens I've used. There's amazing things I could do. There's GPT-4o Mini that's just been announced that's even cheaper. It's more targeted. I would maybe use that instead of GPT-3.5 Turbo, but there's so many options. There's so many things you can go and play with. And I mean, and talking of playing with, again, I just used the default model. One of the things you'd probably want us to go and look at, especially if I am exposing this maybe to internal, to customers, remember you have things like the content filtering. This enables me to create these filters that for the different categories of things out there, for example, violence, hate, sexual, self-harm. And then there's prompt shields to help protect against jailbreak attacks. Prompt shields for indirect attacks. I can block list certain things. On the output, I can go and search for protected text, protected code. Again, I can have a block list. So there's really great capabilities. There's a default set of safety that's just built in, obviously, but I can go and change those things based on exactly what I need for my application to be as protected and safe for my organization and my users as I could possibly be. But I hope provided a little bit of insight and kind of showed how simple it really is. I mean, that script, it's linked in the description, but I wouldn't say that code's something you want to use. But the goal was just to show how I can interact. I don't have to use the SDKs, which wrap the RESTful endpoint in something more language friendly, more intuitive. I can absolutely very easily just use these endpoints for whatever purpose I need. As always, I hope that was useful. Until next video, take care.